we are not going to present something as though we're experts in this, as though we've got all the answers. We're going to talk about our experiences and the reading that we've done and some of the conversations and discussions we've had with peers. So we would like to encourage audience participation. Now, the session has been recorded, so we encourage you to join in at any point and ask any questions, but if you don't want to be recorded, then I suggest that you don't put your video on, otherwise that might be caught in the recording. But please feel free to ask any questions or to put things in the chat box, and we'll respond to those as we go. We haven't got lots of slides, so do feel free to step in at any point. And if you're interested in talking about methodologies at any point, Rachel and I have shared our email addresses. Please feel free to get in touch with us, and we'll be more than happy to have a kind of further discussions around this this approach to gathering data. So I'm going to hand over to you, Rachel. It's going to be more of a conversation between Rachel and I, and you as well. So here we go.
Thanks, Sally. So Sally and I thought we ought to give a little bit of context as to how we came to be collaborating on some data collection research. We're both from very different backgrounds and had never met before until we met at a doctoral conference in September. And they have a kind of theme of, well, a different theme every year, and the theme was change last year. So I presented about my experiences of changing from face-to-face interviews during my qualitative research to non-face-to-face. It was an enforced change because of social distancing, because of the pandemic. My experiences were really positive. So I just presented on what I'd experienced because I was worried that because we were always told that face-to-face was the gold standard in evidence-based practice and research, it felt quite disheartening when we couldn't do that. So actually my experience was very positive, so I presented about that, and Sally and I ended up networking about it, and we've been working together since September quite closely with lots and lots of discussions about data collection during the pandemic and using virtual interviewing. Just to give you a little bit of background about me, I think, just so you understand my context, and then Sally will explain about herself. I'm a locum advanced nurse practitioner working in emergency and urgent care. And in the UK, we currently don't have any regulation for the advanced nurse practitioner or AMP role. So that means that we can have AMPs working in the same work environment with different remits, seeing different types of patients and not having any real strict governance about how we do that. So there's a lot of data out there that explains to us, you know, what advanced nurse practitioners can do in terms of survey-based or questionnaire studies, but we were really missing and had quite a gap looking at something a bit more in depth. So I did an IPA study looking at the phenomenology of the experiences that people were having on the ground doing the work, and kind of the sense-making, meaningful setup and situation of how they got through the shift, and what the feelings were about not being regulated. So that's kind of where my study came in, just to give you a little bit of context. Background.
Thank you, Rachel. So my background was in primary education initially, and I was a SENCO, so I worked a lot with children and families with additional needs. And in 2015, I started working in higher education and continued with my interest in inclusion. And the main area that I worked in was around student mental health and well-being. So from that first-hand experience of being a lecturer in an HE context, there were the ideas for my PhD, and I began thinking about working with undergraduate students and moved to PhD students. And as a result of a number of experiences and finally COVID, my initial ethics application was received for me to carry out face-to-face interviews, and I've used a narrative inquiry approach because I was interested in listening and hearing the views of PhD students. The emphasis around in my work is around the things that people do for their well-being. So I am not asking questions around problems or difficulties. I'm asking them around the things that they do for their well-being. So I wanted to do these interviews face to face because of all the reasons that Rachel's highlighted, that was perceived to be the way to build those connections and provide those opportunities to do the listening. And actually that wasn't possible. So I also had to do that very swift shift, revisiting ethics and moving from face-to-face interviews to virtual interviews. And at that time, because this was in early 2020, there hadn't been a lot of consideration around doing the virtual interviews, and it was the only option. It was that we were faced with, and lots of other PhD students, it was either that or it was to put a hold on your research and wait and hope that we came out the other side of the pandemic and that you would be able to go back to your original plans. So again, initially started off with the idea that this isn't going to produce, or this isn't going to provide an opportunity for us to do this or gather the sort of quality research that we wanted to. However, going through the process, actually there were lots and lots of advantages and lots of positives that we found. And part of my presentation at the East Midlands conference was around that that identity of the researcher, trying to juggle your professional responsibility with your researcher responsibility when that researcher role is being significantly challenged by circumstances that are out of your control. And so what we tried to do, Rachel and I wanted to hang on to the idea that there was something more that we could gain from this virtual interviewing, and that we didn't want to just drop it and move back to face-to-face as soon as it was possible. So we looked at a whole range of different, when we started, we looked at positives and limitations, but actually we've put things together under different topic headings now to try and structure more of I suppose more of a thematic, because lots of things, the more you talk and the more you think about it, the more complex it has become. So we have begun by thinking, so we've got the first slide that I'm going to open with really is around choice, and this covers some of the issues. And Rachel, if you'd like to take over and talk through some of these points, you'll get some idea of how this has been progressing.
So when we did our previous webinar, we took the kind of data that we received from that, and we've been working through it to try and thematically analyse it and pull out key themes. And choice is a theme that was prevalent throughout the entire hour that we spent with the other participants. It seems to be something that kind of overlaps and integrates with all of the other themes as well. And you'll see as we're talking that actually it's really difficult to separate the issues, and also say what was an advantage and a disadvantage is really difficult, because actually it all depends on perspective and context and what your individual experience is, what your research is. But we've tried to gather kind of a list really, just to give you an idea of the things that came out from the previous webinar and from our own experiences. And convenience seems to be a large part of why people feel that moving forward with non-face-to-face interviewing, is a good thing, because it changes the dynamic somewhat. It means that you've got more opportunity to be a participant in a way that is easier for you, and actually it can be very convenient for the researcher as well. In terms of comfort, being able to sit in your own living room at a time that's convenient for you, in your comfortable armchair, with your mug of tea, not having to battle the traffic to get to a clinical type of room for an interview face-to-face for an hour and then battle back through the traffic again. This can have a lot of advantages for people in terms of flexibility and accessibility. We talked about inclusivity as well. I mean, if you look at people with disabilities, physical, mental health needs, it can make life a lot easier for them to be more willing to participate, especially if they've got issues getting out of their home. And from a researcher perspective, it certainly makes life a lot easier in terms of geographical reach, because actually, for me personally, I work 2 hours drive away from where I was recruiting my participants from. So it would have turned my day into a 6-hour day, but actually by being able to connect in a different way that wasn't face-to-face, it made life a lot easier for me and for my participants, who were probably quite exhausted working on the front line during the pandemic. When you look at disadvantages, again, it depends on perspective. We've really grappled with this, and it's just an example of how hard it can be to really work on these themes. But in terms of power shifts and convenience and the impact on the researcher, you can be looking at, if you think about, as a researcher, you have some degree of control. You decide what your research topic is, what your methodology will be, how you will collect the data and how you will analyse it. However, if you're giving people choice and asking them, how would you like me to interview you? Do you want to meet in person, or do you want to do this via telephone or video? You're giving the power to the participant to control how that study will take place. And also potentially as well, it may be that in previous conversations that we've had, that you might have your camera on and the participant might not want to have theirs on. So there's a bit of a power shift there as well, and potentially raises the issue of vulnerability of the researcher. Sally and I have also talked a lot about the analysis of hybrid data, and what we mean by that is, how do you analyse data that has given participants choice in terms of how they will be interviewed? So if you've got a set of participants who you've interviewed face-to-face versus a set of participants who were video or telephone, is there an issue in terms of how we analyse that data? Should there be an issue? I've actually raised this at a recent clinical practice doctoral group, where one of the participants who was collecting hybrid data said that he hadn't even considered that yet. And another one who has done it said she didn't consider it an issue at all because she was looking at only the content. However, it could be argued that, if somebody's being interviewed in their own home and they've got other things going on, they're not completely disconnected from their own personal life. It may be that things like interruptions or other commitments may affect the way that the interview is conducted. So I think, depending on your study, it may be that this needs to be considered as well. Is there anybody that wants to comment on anything that I've said? Or Sally, do you want to add anything?
I can see that somebody's got their hand up, but I think I'm going to ask Amy. You managed that, Amy.
Yeah, Christine, and then myself. So Christine.
Hi. So I, like yourself, was pushed into having to have online interviews because my research was with preschools. And I couldn't go in and observe anymore, and I also couldn't go in, obviously, early 2020 and do face-to-face interviews. So I also went for online Zoom. I have decided, again, this analysis of hybrid data, so I decided that I would be visible, but the participant would not, in order for them to feel perhaps more relaxed and also for their anonymity. But one of the things that I didn't think about, and it's to do with this inclusion exclusion. So I'm looking at children who have additional needs, but the exclusion came where, because many families with children with additional needs are economically disadvantaged, some of the problems I've had is that either the participants don't have access to the technology and therefore can't participate, or one particular participant didn't have enough money on their telephone to be able to participate, and that was not something I'd thought of in advance. Sorry, just it's something ethically I've had to go back and revisit, and I thought it might be useful for others to know.
Thank you, Christine. It's really important, because we're talking about this under the heading of choice, and actually it isn't necessarily as straightforward as choice. And we've used the word agency there in the slide, and there's a suggestion that the researcher has agency and the participants have agency, but what you're highlighting there is the assumption around access to IT. So that's the internet, the phone, the accessibility is not a given. And I think it's an important point. Yes, on one hand, you could say that it's more inclusive, and that could be for the researchers' accessibility or for the participants' accessibility, but that is on the grounds that they have access to the to IT. So it is a really important point in terms of, on one hand it includes and the other hand it excludes. I think what it probably does is shifts the boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. So perhaps it enables some participants, but it excludes others. So it's not necessarily more inclusive or less inclusive, but it's we have to acknowledge the different ends of that.
Yes, I would agree. So it means that while I thought it might make it inclusive to more people, it just makes it inclusive, as you say, to a different set of people, and exclusive to another set of people. And obviously that's just something to bear in mind when you're doing your reflection and your analysis.
I think it's I think it's quite interesting as well, looking at the elderly. We still have, we have a situation now, for example, in the NHS, where a lot of general practice is conducted via text or video consultation, and a lot of the elderly population with complex medical needs don't necessarily still have access to that or an understanding of how to use it efficiently, because they're not using it all the time like younger people are. And also there may be a potential for, if you wanted to do something face-to-face with somebody that was older or a little bit challenged, that they might not have the mobility. So it sounds wonderfully inclusive, doesn't it, that we give people the choice potentially because we can do things with technology, but it doesn't necessarily appeal to all because it's not as accessible to them.
Sarah, you've got your hand up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Wonderful. Hi, I'm a PhD student at the University of Northampton. I'm about to start doing virtual interviews in the next month or two once I've got my ducks in a row. I think Rachel made a comment just earlier about like competing commitments in the background of virtual interviews. And I'd sort of been considering that with that comes, with face-to-face interviews, the onus of responsibility lies on the researcher to maintain that environment of confidentiality. Yet when you step into the virtual space, the responsibility to maintain that confidentiality kind of goes both ways and is placed a lot on the person being interviewed, which, given the kind of power dynamics of researcher and participant, whether they have the I don't know if confidence is the right word, but ability to assert that they're not willing to continue or that they're not comfortable, which maybe brings up an area of consideration. I don't speak as an expert. It was more of an inquiry in your thoughts than anything else.
Do you think it would be a good idea to move on to the next slide, Rachel? To look
at actually, I think it kind of weaves in quite nicely, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you picked up, Sarah, you've identified some points there which have come up in terms of the identity, and in some ways, exactly as you say, if you're working in a virtual context, there's some idea that the researcher has control over what they're presenting. So the researcher can set that up and have some choice over or perceived idea about what they're presenting. They've got some control over their background, or they've got some control over the way that that's being presented. Now, whether your participants have also got that awareness or that capacity, and I think it feeds into something we'll talk about towards the end, but when we were actually in 2020 and we were in the first phase of lockdown, people were thrown into a situation where they had to work from home and they had to adapt really quickly, and everybody was working at home. So we were all pushing things to the side of the kitchen table so that we had a space that we could put the computer on and plug it in. Now, things have changed quite a bit since then. So people don't necessarily have a space anymore where they can work at home, and the expectation that you will be able to work at home or have a space that you can set things out has perhaps shifted because more people have gone back into settings to work, and therefore what your participant, the context that your participant is in, might mean that they're giving away more information than they want to, or they're sharing more of their background or their context than they want to, and that could come from interruptions. And we've talked about this before, that personalized experience where you're building a relationship with the participant, because when we were really in that lockdown situation, not much happened because we didn't go out and nobody really came around, except perhaps you received a delivery, and the interruptions that we experienced tended to be kind of child or pet related, and that was felt to be positive and potentially a benefit in that we could all see that we were all kind of human. But you would be interrupted quite possibly if you were having a face-to-face meeting, but those interruptions would be more likely to be related to the professional context or the setting where you were. So Christine talked about being in early years, that's more likely to be around the educational requirements, whereas when you're in your home, you've got very little say over what that interruption might be. So the nature of the interruptions, I think, is a possible area that you need to consider in terms of keeping people confidential and keeping people safe. There is that blurring here with identities of boundaries. So the idea of these arrows is that it wasn't as simple as positives and negatives. It was more like continuums. On the one hand, you've got this opportunity to have researcher control, but the other side of that is actually these boundaries are being blurred, and they're being blurred between your personal and your research identities, because you might be sitting in your bedroom, or you might be sitting in your kitchen, and therefore you are giving away those aspects. Now, that is perhaps about agency, because perhaps that you set it up and you manage the impression, you provide the background, and you have agency over what you're presenting, and your participants have that potential to do that too. But there is an element of that losing that power and not having that control at all. So I think you've raised an important point in terms of those competing commitments. Really, we're trying to be the researcher, but we're sat in our own homes. So that impression management, can be quite a stressful and exhausting experience. And for PhD researchers, that's something that has been picked up in research, that PhD researchers spend a lot of time trying to present certain sides of themselves to certain communities, and the part of their impression management happens within the academic context. And in this case, it's about them presenting that they are credible researchers. You know, that sort of idea around imposter syndrome. You know, we're trying really hard to be a credible researcher, but I'm sitting on the edge of my bed trying not to show the rest of my room. You know, it kind of can have that tension too. And I think with the safety as well, because potentially you're in people's houses, and that can be a benefit. I know people spoke about their experiences of people showing them things in the spaces that they were in, which enhanced the interview or the interaction. But that's when you're consciously making that decision to show those things and share those things. There's a chance that you might witness things or see or hear things that raise safeguarding or health and safety concerns, and there are things there that you then need to raise or take further. I don't think I've answered that in as much as there was any kind of answer, Sarah, but I think, has that helped?
Yeah, thank you. It's given a few things to think about as well that I haven't yet kind of fully considered. It was more sort of maintaining, I suppose, safety and confidentiality when you are not the person in control of the environment. you know, you invite somebody into a university building space and, you know, you both know at the same time if someone walks in the door and you can pause the conversation. You don't, because you can't see the background, you can't see who's walked in, you can't control your participants' environment as you can in a more kind of academic setting. Then do they have that confidence, that agency within that kind of power dynamic to be able to feel that they're able to halt, and sort of making that explicit that they're able to, and relying on them to take that onus of control with their own confidentiality, if that makes sense.
It does, and it's a really important point, and we talked about this in terms of there's a potential that you're going to get a greater responsibility if your participants feel comfortable because they're in a space that they've chosen. But the other side of that is that actually it can be really intense just sitting looking at the screen, and perhaps it's a limitation that you're sitting facing the screen, and that if you were with somebody you would perhaps change your position so that you were sitting parallel, or you were both looking and facing in the same direction together rather than sitting and facing each other. So I think you're right, those nuances of interaction are more limited. I mean, ultimately your participants can turn the camera off or exit the room. So in some ways that would be much harder to leave a physical space if we both agreed to meet in a university context, and then I felt like I didn't want to be part of the interview anymore. I'd have to get up and leave. I could just turn my computer off if I really felt like I didn't want to go on with this any further, and I could send you a message later on and say, really sorry, there seems to be a problem with the internet. So I think for all of these, there are so many different variables, and I think it's all about ethics. And Rachel and I have had endless conversations that come back to ethics and the detail of the ethics, which I think probably we were less aware of when we started than we are now. Would you agree with that, Rachel?
Absolutely. And I was just thinking about in terms of ethics, I know when I did my pre-interview admin, that's something that you would normally do face to face on the day before the interview, potentially, for example, consent and going through the kind of the briefs and everything. But you had to do that beforehand to make sure that you had signed consent before you turned up on the meeting for the interview, for example, otherwise you wouldn't be able to go ahead with it. And it just makes me think, really, I'd not thought about it like that before, that you've got to be really careful about what you're sharing in that background. For example, if you've got children in the house and you've got a child running around in front of the screen or grabbing it, you've got the ethical considerations of who is appropriate to be captured on that video at that time. And it may be something that to think about in advance before, while you're doing your housekeeping, to explain, you know, if there's anything that you feel uncomfortable with, or if a conversation starts, if your husband comes in and starts telling you off about how much you've spent on the credit card this month, you might not want to share that with everybody else. So hit your mute button, turn your camera off, and then come back. So it might be just kind of advising people that are participating in your research that perhaps aren't doing this as frequently as we are, just reminding them that you do have control. You can stop this at any time if you don't want to share something, because we are in your living room or your study, and you know we have to take that into account, really. So it's an extra housekeeping thing that are very, very important ethically to think about before you conduct your research.
Because
that yeah, I think in terms of the forms that you mentioned, I'll be putting in something to do with housekeeping, and should your environment situation change, then you know to flag it to make sure that they're as comfortable as possible. But thank you very much for your responses.
Because you can always pause, can't you, with a recording? You can always pause it and then pick it up again if that's deemed to be appropriate. I think in some ways the potential for enhanced truth that we talked about, which is the idea that if the participants are really comfortable in their preferred scenario, there's potential for kind of a kind of the outward identity might provide you with further additional information to your story. And that again comes back to ethics, because it depends whether you're recording it and analysing the video, or whether your ethical approval is for you to record it for a transcript. And they're different points, and they're important points to consider. Rachel mentioned earlier on about what people hybrid analysis of data, and I wonder about virtual interviewing when some people have the camera on and some people have the camera off. So Christine was clear in her discussion at the beginning that she was having her computer on and the participants were having it off. But with others, you might say put your screen on, or choose whether to put your screen on, or picking up on that point, maybe you haven't got a screen you can put on. But as you can revisit and as part of your analysis, you look at what you've got, I wonder whether that has an impact on how you analyse that data, whether that's something that needs to be taken into consideration when you look at it. If you're face to face, you're all face to face, and whether you record it or you take notes, that's pretty consistent. So I think it's these differences and nuances that raise the questions around the validity of your data.
Could I ask something related to that, please?
Please do, yes.
I mean, yeah, I've been doing some online focus groups, but what I ended up doing was, you know, getting people to leave their cameras on, but then audio recording it. I mean, yeah, like you said, there's a sort of an issue there about what kind of recording you do, and you know, just because people have their cameras on doesn't mean to say that you have to do the kind of audio-visual recording, does it either? You know, so but I wonder whether, because the traditional thing, isn't it, in sort of qualitative interviews, is that you audio record them, isn't it? Really, you don't normally do audio-visual recording. I mean, focus groups, sometimes if you've got the facilities in the past, you would do that. I mean, I worked for a while in a sort of university. I had this kind of focus group lab sort of thing, which was seen as very, you know, sort of advanced sort of setup, and you would actually then video the focus groups, and then the idea was that it provided you know, sort of more enhanced way of recording things, because then you could look at people's, you know, kind of body language, etc., and sort of bring that into your analysis and etc. But I mean, I suppose in the past, normally speaking, you just wouldn't really have had the sort of technology, would you? You would have just audio record a focus group as well. But I mean, there are other reasons for that as well, of course, you know, ethically and practically, and in terms of how uncomfortable people might be made to feel and so on. But it's just an interesting thing to know whether, you know, sort of moving to doing some things online, has that also meant that people tend to do these audio-visual recordings more, or, you know, because as I say, you don't necessarily have to kind of move to that. You could just audio record still, couldn't you?
You could, and it's a good point. I didn't get ethical approval to use video, so I didn't analyse the body language. I recorded using, and I did have the video, but I had to discount it because that hadn't been part of my ethics. But Rachel, I think one of your peers has ethical approval, particularly for video, don't they? Do you want to say a bit about that?
All I know about it is that she had to jump through a lot of hoops ethically to get her ethics application to explain and justify her reasons for wanting to record the video. I think she's doing an ethnographic study, and it's a very kind of personal topic regarding illness. So I'm not sure if part of what she's doing is kind of looking at their home life and their adaptations to living post-illness. So it may be that it's very relevant that she needs to be able to video record as well. But she had a lot of challenges through the ethics application, because it's a difficult world we're living in now. You know, kind of participant researcher, you know, you think you're with people that are safe, but we live in a difficult world. And I think to be able to justify potentially having access to video recordings of people is a massive challenge. Even if you're not recording the video, you're just recording the audio, you still have access to their video. you know. So I think it does pose a lot of challenges, and that's where the ethics comes in. I think that's why my colleague had a lot of difficulties going forward with it, really.
Yeah, there's been a bit of a rise on that, and there, 'cause it's something called like some virtual ethnography or something, isn't it? But like you say, it's a bit, you know, it's very sort of ethically sort of tenuous thing. But yeah, no, I just sort of thought, you know, because there's pros and cons to it anyway, aren't there, when it comes to just a standard kind of focus group or interview. But it's almost like then you could sort of assume that you would sort of do that kind of recording, you know, but of course you don't need to include the visual bit. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, can I just say that I'm also I'm an EdD student, but I redid my ethics 6 times because I had to get in those clear boundaries, because these issues kept coming up, and obviously children, because I was looking at early years, children might appear in the videos. So I did a lot of research and I chose to use Zoom, and the reason for that, and I've got the paid up version of it, is because it will record the audio and the visual separately for you, and I then keep the audio and I discard the video.
And mine was similar.
Hi. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say I only wanted the audio, but the system that the university had that I needed to use recorded the video, so I had to transcribe from the audio and then disregard the video. But I had to, because I didn't have permission to use it. But that's interesting that you can do it in that way through Zoom. Thank you for sharing that.
I mean, you can also just use a handheld recorder, of course, like you would in a face-to-face one, online type of thing.
Jo, I feel like I heard you.
Oh yeah, no. What I wanted to sort of say was, one thing that I'm finding really interesting is some of the discussions you're having almost about, obviously, the process of applying for ethics is so important, and it's so important that you cover everything, and you know that you don't overstep what you're allowed to do. But I think that there's real value to be said in kind of encouraging, almost like looking back at your data once you have collected it, and even on personal comfort levels, or if you have any concerns about how a participant may have seemed within a session, being able to follow up on that. So, for example, even if you had permission to record, just because you have permission to do something doesn't mean you have to, if you feel it's actually having a negative impact on your results. So say, for example, you might have permission to record and you're recording video, asking people to have video on, but then you think it makes some participants hesitant. Like, one of the things that we found in some of our work with students is having that conversation where you might say, oh, I know we set out to sort of say like video on, but I think some people are finding that challenging. So let's try this session with video off. But of course, then there are so many considerations within that, but almost like as part of the evolving kind of process, sometimes having that dialogue and that relationship with your interviewees or with your focus groups can be really, really helpful. I don't know if that speaks to anything that you guys found, or you would say that that's a fair comment.
I would totally agree with that, and I think Rachel and I've had a lot of conversations where it's been an evolving discussion, because the more you do and the more you talk to other people about their experiences, the more complex it becomes. And just thinking that you're going from face-to-face to virtual interviewing, and that pretty much the ethics is the same, we are about 1 million miles away from that now. Would you agree with that, Rachel?
Yeah, the whole context has changed, hasn't it? I think looking back to when I was going through the ethics process, the ethics application process, it was just at the beginning of the pandemic, and that's why I had to go back and amend and review the literature, which was quite disheartening because we didn't have any pandemic research about this kind of issue of data collecting. We just had to go on what had been done pre-pandemic, and it wasn't hugely useful. And of course, as we've moved along through the pandemic, and we're kind of sort of coming out the other side, I think, you know, we have to start looking at, you know, what can we take forward? How does this help us? What are the challenges? How do we overcome them? And it's all about being safe and transparent. So it has shifted over time, I think, Sally. It's not it's not an easy answer to any of these questions, because we're still dealing with it and we're still trying to figure out how best to move forward in the future in terms of this, I think. Should we move on to the next slide, Sally? Oh, we're already up, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the other major themes that came out from our previous webinar was the notion of context. And as you can see, kind of it all overlaps with one another. There's lots of interlinking here, and just about what is appropriate for your individual research. As researchers, we set it all out as to how we want to conduct our research, the methodology, the data collection, changing things, whether it's, you know, we're going back to face now, or if we're doing a hybrid or just the virtual interviewing. It does depend on your individual study and the types of participants. And just to give an example, for my research, I was interviewing people that were working on the front line through the pandemic and collecting data through the pandemic. So I was aware that personally, I was exhausted and a bit fed up, to say the least. And I was anxious that if I didn't do my research soon, I may potentially lose participants because they were too exhausted to be interested in doing any research in their own time, whether it's at home or in a meeting room at work. So I think it depends on what the type of research is, and certainly what you need to be thinking about is, for example, IPA, where you're looking at that deep and meaningful, you know, sense-making feelings of how you deal with a particular context. You kind of need to have a good relationship with your participants to be able to get meaningful data. So you've got to look at, you know, which is the best way to enhance that data collecting experience. So whether it's, you know, being interviewed in a clinical environment or being at home and relaxed away from work, it certainly seemed to work in my experience, because my colleagues that were participants were not in that kind of scrum of busy 6-hour waiting time, stress, people walking in, wanting, demanding your attention. So it does predominantly look at the particular research that you're doing. What is your study? What are you hoping for? What is the context? So it might be that the things that we're talking about don't affect you in any way, or it might be that actually it's a really significant part of how you conduct your research. And we've just discussed about video research and telephone research and face-to-face. It completely depends on the actual context of what your study is, and just making sure that it works appropriately. And I feel that we can go back to choice here, because now we have that choice of, let's look at what is available, what do the participants want, what works best for them, what works best for the study. Have you got anything else to add there, Sally?
I could give an example from my own experience, in that the participants that I was working with at that point in time were PhD students, and I was asking them to give me a narrative around what was working for their well-being. And so they were all in a very similar position to me as a PhD student. They were all either trying to find ways to get around the lockdown restrictions, or they were enforced in some cases to suspend what they were doing and wait until the conditions were different and they were able to return to what they had initially started. Some people were part way through, so they'd started doing interviews themselves, collecting their data face to face, and then they were having to pick up and carry on using virtual. So they were further on with their research. And a narrative inquiry meant that I was not asking lots of questions. I was just providing people with an opportunity to tell me their stories. And I think that kind of resonates a little bit with Amy's point in the chat box around sitting looking at your own face. That's kind of what you're doing when you're doing those interviews. And I did all of mine virtually. And I distinctly remember meeting somebody and talking to them when we came out of lockdown, and really enjoying having a conversation with somebody where I wasn't looking at my own face, where I was able to look at somebody else's face, but also not look at their face and still maintain that conversation. So I could look beyond them, or we could look at something together, or our eyes just freely moved around in a way that we hadn't been doing when we were using the screen. So I think the context aspect is, there's been research carried out during the pandemic about the ways of gathering data, but I think Rachel and I have become really acutely aware that the data we collected was collected during that first lockdown of the pandemic. So our participants were recruited, and for the most part their lives were very limited. So my participants were not seeing very many other people. They weren't going into any kind of office. Their work, if they were still working, it had been disrupted, that they weren't having any social interactions, and they weren't really going outside very much at all. It was at that time when you were allowed outside to exercise only. And so what they were talking about in that context and their willingness to participate virtually is going to be very different from any participating now, because we've all had that experience of living through the pandemic. So our experiences of using virtual now to communicate with people is huge compared to how it was at the beginning of 2020. So we've all used Zoom for work, for social, for all sorts of ways, and we've perhaps become a little bit more understanding of how it works and how it can work to your advantage, or what the limitations are. So where virtual interviewing now is different to the virtual interviewing that Rachel and I did, and it's different, as Rachel pointed out. All the research, when we looked to shifting to virtual, the research was based on, why would you do virtual if you can do face-to-face? Whereas now we have the experience of other people's and the benefits of learning from other people's experiences, and our own experiences of working using virtual ways. So yeah, I think for PhD students and well-being and mental health, it provided an opportunity, and that worked. But it's so reliant on who your participants are, and people have talked earlier about children, about special educational needs. It hugely depends on your participant group, and I think the implications for ethics again are so reliant on that.
I think there's also been, like you've just said, a shifting continuum throughout the course of the pandemic. So, in the beginning, when we weren't allowed out and everything had to be done online, it affected people like us that were conducting research, but it affected everybody generally anyway. And I think to some degree, people were trying to find ways to fill their time in almost. So we're probably in some respect keen to do things online in ways that they would never have done before. So that may have aided our research perhaps at the time, but then as things have shifted and people were desperate to get out and see people face to face, it may be again that would have been their preference, because they were sick of being holed up in the house and having to do everything on the telephone or via video. But I think it just brings it back to the appropriateness for your study, really, what the context is for you as a researcher, and what your methodology is, and how, what your subject content is, as to what's appropriate. And it takes us again back to control and that power dynamic of, yes, it might be to some degree a good plan to give participants a big involvement in the choice and the decision making, but it still needs to be appropriate to the type of research that you're doing. It could be very, a very sensitive topic, or something that really isn't very sensitive, where it doesn't really matter. But I think it is very much about the context of your own study, and remembering that your methodology needs, and your data collection needs to be suitable to what you're trying to gain at the end of it. Has anybody got any questions that they'd like to talk about, or any comments on anything that we've discussed?
Helen.
Hi. Yes, I just want to go back to the discussion around the recording of interviews, and I've just submitted my research proposal to the Ethics Committee, so I'm waiting to hear back on the feedback and hoping now, after hearing you all, that I'm not going to have to jump through lots of loops to video my interviews. My interviews are going to be with adults, but I'm using Teams because that's the technology that's recommended by our IT department for a security perspective. So I just wondered, from a limited technology perspective, in Teams, the only way to record an interview is to have the camera on and record it. Is that right?
No, you can record without camera on for both yourself and participant.
Okay, but if you actually wanted to have the camera on so you could maintain eye contact and that rapport with people, you wouldn't be able to just do an audio recording, you'd have to do a visual recording.
No, you'd have to do a visual
Yes.
recording, yes.
Yes, okay. Again, it's that practical, ethical balance between having the eye contact with somebody, but obviously you're going to get their image on screen then when you do the recording. Okay, thank you.
But can I just say, check and see if it gives you 2 recordings, because what happens with Zoom is I get an audio recording and I get a video recording, and I'm able to just discard, put in the bin, the video recording and keep the audio one. So it's worth playing about to see what it does.
Okay, well, I might have a thank you for that suggestion. I will.
One thing you should be able to do is, when you have a recording on Teams, if you go to the 3 little dots next to it, you should be able to download it to your computer, and then in your downloads folder you can right click and it will give you the option of where you wish to open it. So if you open it in, say, an audio player, it may then allow you to listen to it without the video. So you're not actually listening, you're not actually watching it back on Teams or on OneDrive. If you do it off of the Microsoft platform, I think you might be able to, it doesn't give you the 2 files in the way that Zoom does, it doesn't separate them out, but you might be able to open the file in a program that doesn't require the video to play.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. It's good to have, I'll do some exploring before the Ethics Committee come back, in case that's a challenge over how long I want to hold the video for. Lovely, thank you.
Yeah.
And I think that's the other point I would just say.